Lady Sarah Churchill refused to be a silent ornament. While the world expected her to live a life dutifully fulfilling her aristocratic role, she rebelled. She ran away to the stage, joined the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, and even stood shoulder to shoulder with her father at Yalta. She lived a life 10 times the intensity of any ordinary person. But living with such intensity extracts a price. The fierce independence she fought to secure morphed into an uncontrollable, turbulent existence. This is the story of how a fiery spirit was consumed by its own blaze, a tragedy of addiction, devastating loss, and the cruel reality of becoming the black sheep in the world's most renowned family. Lady Sarah Churchill's life was an intricate dance, performed before a world that expected a graceful waltz. It was not the journey of a perfectly polished socialite. It was the story of a rebellious fire, an artistic heart imprisoned within the fortress of duty. Above all, it is a painful lesson in the cost of being both a Churchill and desperately trying to be oneself. The world Sarah entered on October 7, 1914, just weeks after the world set itself ablaze, was one of rigid hierarchies and unyielding traditions, particularly in Britain. The guns of August were still echoing across the Channel. Her father, Winston, was the First Lord of the Admiralty, already a figure of immense ambition and polarizing controversy. Her birth was no quiet family event. It was the arrival of a new soul into a world at war and into a family already at the very epicenter of national destiny. This was the fading Edwardian era, when the twilight of the old aristocracy was giving way to the turbulent dawn of the 20th century. For the peerage, life still proceeded at a familiar, luxurious cadence. To be a Churchill meant a life steeped in history, politics, and a nearly unbearable burden of expectation. It meant summers at Blenheim Palace, where her ancestor, the first Duke of Marlborough, reigned supreme. It meant lessons in posture, comportment, and presentations to royalty. It meant a path largely drawn for you, a suitable marriage, perhaps some charitable work, and the silent maintenance of the family's formidable prestige. But the early 20th century was also a moment of seismic change. The low growl of jazz was beginning to drown out polite orchestras. Hemlines were rising, and women emboldened by the suffragette movement were beginning to dream of lives beyond the drawing room. The stiff collars and corsets of the Victorian age were yielding to flapper dresses and a thirst for personal freedom. This nascent sense of individualism, though still largely class-bound, offered tantalizing glimpses of a world where one could perhaps forge one's own identity. This was the backdrop for Sarah's upbringing, a world of contradictions. On one side stood Blenheim Palace and 10 Downing Street, dark, wood-paneled corridors of power where empire-shaping decisions were made. On the other was the whisper of a new world, a world of art, expression, and bohemianism. For a spirited, artistic young woman like Sarah, born with a restless soul and a formidable intellect, this tension between expectation and desire would become the central drama of her life. Sarah, the second daughter of Winston and Clementine Churchill, was never one to fit easily into a prescribed mold. She was never meant to be the heir. That burden fell on her brother Randolph, nor was she the eldest. That position belonged to her sister Diana. Sarah's middle position afforded her a unique space to forge an identity that was both loyal and rebellious. From an early age, she possessed an independent streak, a fiery spirit she inherited in spades from her famous father. Winston, the man who would soon rally an entire nation, was a complex figure of intense emotion, black dog depressions, and explosive energy. Sarah's bond with him was profound. He adored her, calling her affectionately Mule, not because she was slow-witted, but because of her lovable obstinacy and iron will. In a family of extraordinary personalities, Sarah was one of the few who could tease him, amuse him, and reach him on a personal level few others could. She was Daddy's girl, a source of joy and light in his stormy life, but if her relationship with her father was one of mutual warmth and admiration, her relationship with her mother, Clementine, was infinitely more complex. Clementine Churchill was a formidable figure in her own right. She was a woman of classical beauty, sharp intelligence, and rigid principles, but she was also the product of a difficult upbringing. Her own mother, Lady Blanche Hosier, was eccentric and somewhat notorious. Clementine carried a nervous tension, an omnipresent anxiety, and a nearly pathological perfectionism. She was not a warm mother. She loved her children with an intense, anxious, and often critical love. She set impossibly high standards. She expected perfection because she feared, correctly, that the world would be merciless to any weak Churchill. For the artistic, free-spirited Sarah, this intense scrutiny and rigid expectations from Clementine often created conflict. It was a lifelong struggle, the desperate need for her mother's approval versus the urgent need to be herself. Tragedy struck the family when Sarah was just 6. Her younger sister, Marigold, died from septicemia. It was a devastating loss that left a scar on the family that never truly healed. For Winston, it was an inconsolable grief. For Clementine, the pain nearly destroyed her, making her even more distant and anxious. For the young Sarah, her sister's death was an early reminder of life's fragility. It seeped into the family's consciousness, an undercurrent of sorrow that shaped their dynamics in ways they may never have fully realized. It further solidified Sarah's sense that life was not something to be passively accepted, but something to be grasped, to be lived intensely. As Sarah grew, she received the education of other young women of her class. Governesses, followed by boarding school, including a stint at Notting Hill High School and later in Paris. But she showed little interest in the classical curriculum or the preparation for becoming an aristocratic hostess. Her heart lay elsewhere. It was in the world of imagination. She was captivated by poetry, by literature, and most of all, by the theater. This was the first real collision with tradition. The 1920s and early 1930s saw the height of the bright young things. This was a generation of young aristocrats who reacted to the horrors of the Great War with a frenzied appetite for parties, jazz, and shocking behavior. They organized midnight treasure hunts across London, wore extravagant fancy dress, and lived as if there were no tomorrow. Sarah, with her dazzling beauty and independent spirit, was certainly drawn to the edges of this world, but she was more than just a party chaser. The energy of the age, the breaking of conventions, the celebration of the individual resonated with something deeper inside her. It solidified her resolve that her life would not merely be a series of debutante balls and an arranged marriage. She wanted more. She wanted a purpose of her own, and then she found it, the stage. Lady Sarah Churchill's decision to become a professional actress was not merely a career choice. It was a declaration of independence, an act of rebellion. In her circles, going on the stage was still considered somewhat disreputable. It was viewed as a trade, not a profession for a lady. It was associated with bohemians, with questionable morals, with an unstable and even scandalous life. For the granddaughter of a duke and the daughter of one of the country's leading politicians, it was a nearly unthinkable choice. We must grasp the shock this implied. Today we take celebrity children entering the arts for granted. But in the 1930s, the British class system was still incredibly rigid. For a woman of her class to earn her own living, especially in a public and somewhat low-field like the theater, was a serious transgression of the rules. Her family's reaction was predictable. Clementine was horrified. She viewed it as a disgraceful impulse, a lowering of herself that would bring ridicule upon the Churchill name. She tried to dissuade her, employing every emotional and social pressure she could muster. She feared Sarah would be exploited, that she would fail, that she would destroy herself. Winston's reaction was more complicated. On the one hand, he was a traditionalist who understood the weight of their name. He worried for her. But on the other, Winston was no stuffy aristocrat. He was an artist in his own right, a brilliant writer who would win the Nobel Prize in Literature, a passionate amateur painter. He had a romantic, bohemian soul hidden deep inside the politician. He understood the creative urge. He recognized his own stubborn will in his daughter. In a letter he wrote of his deep anxiety, yet he could not completely extinguish her ambition. After much fierce debate, tears, and pleading, a compromise was reached. Sarah would not simply run off to join a touring company. She would be properly trained. She enrolled in the prestigious Royal Academy of Dramatic Art in London. It was a concession, an attempt to cloak her scandalous career choice in a veneer of respectability. Sarah's time at RADA confirmed her passion. She threw herself into her studies: elocution, movement, script analysis. She proved this was no rich girl's whim. She was serious. She was talented. Her teachers recognized a compelling presence, emotional intelligence, and an undeniable star quality. For the first time in her life, Sarah felt she belonged somewhere, not because she was a Churchill, but because she was Sarah. She began her career humbly, taking the stage name Sarah Hosier, in an attempt to avoid unwanted attention. She worked in touring companies, taking small roles. In 1936, she had her first major breakthrough when she was cast in a lead role in the West End play Follow the Sun. Her career was taking off, but it was in this new, turbulent, bohemian world, the world of struggling actors, late-night rehearsals, shabby flats, and smoky cafes, that she met the man who would trigger her first major personal crisis. He was no aristocrat. He was no wealthy landowner or promising military officer. He was Vic Oliver, born Victor Samek. Vic Oliver was an Austrian-born comedian, musician, and variety star. He was nearly 20 years her senior. He was divorced, and he was Jewish. Against the backdrop of rising anti-Semitism in Europe and the class rigidity of British society, each of these elements was a flashing red flag to the Churchill family. But Sarah was captivated. Oliver was everything her world was not. He was funny, worldly, talented, and completely unimpressed by her lineage. He saw her, the actress, the woman, not the Churchill symbol. To Sarah, who had spent her life struggling against her family's shadow, this was intoxicating. She fell deeply and impulsively in love. The relationship was an open secret, and it caused a firestorm within her family. Clementine was utterly shocked. She viewed Oliver as an opportunist, a low-class fame seeker exploiting her innocent daughter. Winston was deeply anxious too, not just about the age and background difference, but about the stability of a man in the volatile entertainment industry. They pleaded with her. They reasoned with her. They forbade her. Clementine wrote desperate letters, warning Sarah she was throwing away her life and that she was bringing deep distress to her father at a time when he was facing immense political pressures. But Sarah, the obstinate mule, would not be swayed. Driven by love and a fierce defiance to choose for herself, she did the unthinkable. In 1936, while touring with a play in the United States, Sarah Churchill secretly married Vic Oliver at New York City Hall. She did not inform her parents. They learned the news from the newspapers. The explosion was immediate and devastating. Clementine was broken. She felt betrayed, publicly humiliated. The mother-daughter relationship, already strained, was shattered. Winston, though also deeply angered and hurt, was more pragmatic in his response. He knew his daughter had made her choice, and he knew complete estrangement would benefit no one. He wrote Sarah a letter that conveyed a complex mixture of paternal disappointment and unconditional love. He expressed his grief, but finished by saying, "I send you my love and my blessings. I feel that you have acted not on impulse, but with consideration." This marriage set the stage for the next phase of Sarah's life. It took her to America, further out of the Churchill family orbit. It cemented her status as the black sheep, one who had chosen her own path, but it was also the beginning of a pattern that would repeat throughout her life, an attraction to complex, talented, and often troubled figures, a search for love and acceptance outside the rigid boundaries of the world she was born into. She had chosen to sing. And just as Capote would later observe, she had chosen the messiest pond imaginable, the chaotic intersection of theatrical ambition, public scrutiny, and a marriage that defied every convention she had ever known. The Swan had left the sheltered waters of Blenheim. She was swimming on her own in the vast, choppy ocean. Life in America with Vic Oliver was a whirlwind. Sarah threw herself into it with all her energy. She and Oliver became a famous couple, a fixture in the society columns. They performed together on radio and sometimes on stage. Oliver, with his continental humor, had a large American audience, and Sarah, with her beauty and aristocratic lineage, provided an irresistible glamour. Superficially, it was a charmed life. They lived in Hollywood, then New York. They socialized with the era's biggest stars. But beneath the glittering surface, the marriage soon showed cracks. The age and personality differences began to tell. Oliver, accustomed to being the center of attention, reportedly grew jealous of Sarah's own rising success. And Sarah, though she loved her husband, began to feel suffocated by his possessiveness and volatile temper. Crucially, the world was changing. Back in Britain, her father was no longer in the wilderness. In 1939, war broke out. In 1940, Winston Churchill became prime minister. Instantly, the name Sarah had tried to distance herself from now became the most important name in the world. She was no longer just an aristocratic actress. She was the daughter of the man leading the fight against fascism. The burden of history, which she had tried to flee, now pulled her back with an irresistible force. Her personal life, her rocky marriage, her budding career were all now set against the backdrop of a global conflict. And Sarah Churchill, the actress, would soon face her most challenging role, the part of a wartime daughter, torn between family loyalty, duty to country, and the growing troubles in her own heart. By choosing to sing in her own messy pond, Sarah had swum out to the vast ocean, but she didn't know the entire ocean was about to catch fire. As London burned under the German Blitz, her new glamorous but empty life in America suddenly felt like a betrayal. The family's black sheep, the one who had fled duty, now found herself pulled back by an irresistible force, the war. The greatest role of her life was not on a stage, but at her father's side, at the very crucible of world history. As London burned, Sarah lived far away, surrounded by Hollywood premieres and New York radio shows, a safety that must have felt like exile. But that physical safety must have been a psychological torture. Every news bulletin, every photograph of a bombed London, every defiant speech from her father echoing across the global airwaves was a reminder that she was far away. She was more than just an expatriate Brit. She was the daughter of Winston Churchill, and her home, her family, was on the front line of the free world's fight for survival. The internal conflict must have been fierce. On one hand, she had fought hard for her independence, to be Sarah Churchill, actress, not Churchill's daughter. She had built a career, a marriage, a life in America. On the other, how could she stand on stage, smiling for the cameras, while the people of London were sleeping in the tube stations? How could she sustain her increasingly fractured marriage to Vic Oliver, a man who seemed to belong to an entirely different reality, when her father was carrying the fate of the Western world on his shoulders? The pull of duty, the Churchill blood in her veins, became too strong to ignore. In 1941, even before America formally entered the war, Sarah made a decision that changed her life's trajectory. She returned to England not as a returning movie star, but as a daughter returning home in crisis. And she did more than just come home. She enlisted. Imagine the shock. Lady Sarah Churchill, who had been on movie posters, who had danced with a vision of Fred Astaire in her mind, signed up as an ordinary servicewoman in the Women's Auxiliary Air Force. This was no ceremonial role. She was not there for propaganda photos in a perfectly tailored uniform. She went through basic training. She learned to salute, to obey orders, and to become a tiny cog in a massive military machine. Initially, there was skepticism. The other women in the barracks looked at her with a mix of curiosity and suspicion. A Churchill? Here? They expected a fragile lady, an amateur who would quit after the first week. But they underestimated the stubborn mule. Sarah threw herself into the work with a ferocious determination. She was intent on proving herself not as the Prime Minister's daughter, but as aircraft woman Churchill. She was quickly recognized for her keen intelligence. She was assigned to one of the most critical and secretive branches of the war effort, photo intelligence analysis. Her job at RAF Medmenham, a secret base, was anything but glamorous. It was intense and vital. Daily Spitfire and Mosquito pilots flew dangerous reconnaissance missions over enemy territory, taking thousands of photographs. Those photos came to Sarah's unit. Her job was to stare at those grainy, modeled pictures for hours, looking for the minute details that could reveal the enemy's secrets. This was a job that required extraordinary patience and an excruciatingly sharp eye. What would she be looking for? An unusual disturbance in the ground that might be a newly camouflaged V-2 rocket launching site, a faint shadow on the water near a Norwegian port that could be the battleship Tirpitz, a blurry streak in a French field that might indicate the movement of a panzer division. The lives of thousands of soldiers, the success of bombing raids, and even the timing of the D-Day invasion hinged on the ability of interpreters like Sarah to spot these clues. It was an unimaginable pressure. She worked long, tiring shifts in cold Nissen huts, underslept, knowing that one mistake, one missed detail could lead to catastrophe. It was in this role that her father began to see her with new eyes. He no longer saw just his impulsive, artistic daughter. He saw an intelligent, dedicated officer doing vital war work. Winston Churchill trusted intelligence. He was hungry for detailed information. And now his daughter was one of the people providing it. Their bond gained a new depth, a mutual respect forged in the crucible of conflict. But Sarah's most crucial role in the war was not at the photo analysis table. It was at her father's side. Winston Churchill was a man who needed domestic support. He relied heavily on his wife Clementine, but she was often exhausted by the strain of the war and his volatile moods. He needed someone he could trust absolutely, not just politically, but emotionally. Someone who could be with him during the moments of highest pressure, someone who could understand his burdens without judgment, and someone who was completely loyal. He chose Sarah. As a WAAF officer, she could accompany him in an official capacity as an aide-de-camp. It was the perfect cover. But her true role was far deeper. She was his confidant, his gatekeeper, and his emotional anchor. And it was in this capacity that Sarah Churchill became a direct, close-range witness to some of the 20th century's most critical moments. Imagine the scene. Tehran, November 1943. This was the first meeting of the Big Three: Churchill, U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, and Soviet leader Joseph Stalin. The future of the war and the fate of the world hung in the balance. The air was thick with tension, suspicion, and political maneuvering. And there, in the smoke-filled rooms, amidst the giants who were redrawing the world map, was Officer Sarah Churchill. She was not there to negotiate. She was there to observe, to listen, and to be there for her father. She wrote about these moments later. She described the tense atmosphere, the stark contrast between a charming but frail Roosevelt, an enigmatic, terrifying Stalin with his yellow eyes and his creepy, charming smile, and her father, who was battling not only the enemy, but the changing reality of the global power balance. America and Russia were clearly the rising superpowers, and the British Empire, which her father had sworn to defend, was starting to fade. Sarah sat in on dinners, listening to the toasts and the veiled allusions. She watched her father spar with Stalin, trying to win concessions for Poland, trying to safeguard British interests. She saw the cost of supreme power. She saw her father age before her eyes, bearing the weight of millions of lives. At night, when the formal meetings were over, she would be with him. He would dictate memos to her or simply talk, unloading his frustrations and anxieties onto the one person he knew would never betray his trust. She became his gatekeeper, protecting him from unnecessary demands, ensuring he rested, and most importantly, providing a presence of unjudging familial love amidst the ruthless political landscape. She was the tether connecting him to his family, to normalcy, to his own humanity. This role continued at the other crucial conferences. She was there at Quebec, and then, in February 1945, she accompanied him to perhaps the most vital and tragic of them all, Yalta. If Tehran was about how to win the war, Yalta was about how to divide the spoils. The war in Europe was nearly over. Victory was within reach. But the atmosphere was not one of celebration. It was one of tense bargaining, of a new world order being painfully hammered out. Roosevelt, whom Churchill deeply adored, was clearly dying. He had only weeks left to live. He was weak, and some historians argue too willing to concede to Stalin to secure Russian entry into the war against Japan and his vision for the United Nations. Stalin, on the other hand, was at the height of his power. The Red Army had liberated most of Eastern Europe, and he had no intention of relinquishing it. Sarah was there, watching her father fight a nearly losing battle. He fought for a free and independent Poland, but he knew it was a hollow hope. He witnessed, in quiet horror, the Iron Curtain beginning to be drawn right before his eyes. Sarah wrote about the chilling cold of Yalta, both physical and emotional. She described the weariness that enveloped her father, the burden of knowledge he carried. Again, she was his silent support. She organized his papers. She sat in on the peripheral meetings. She was the only person in the entire delegation who could speak to the Prime Minister as his daughter, ask him if he'd slept, ensure he ate, and provide a small moment of domestic peace amid the geopolitical storm. P.A., we cannot underestimate the psychological impact of these experiences on Sarah. The young woman who had fled the burden of the Churchill name was now at the very core of global power. She had seen history not through books, but through the tired eyes of the men who were making it. She had seen the brutal cost of war and the harsh, unforgiving truth of power politics. This experience changed her forever. It gave her a maturity, a gravitas, but perhaps it also left scars. It showed her the peak of human achievement and the emptiness and compromise that came with it. When the war in Europe ended in May 1945, Sarah stood with her family on the Buckingham Palace balcony, looking out at the cheering sea of humanity. She wore her WAAF uniform. It was a moment of ultimate triumph. Her father was the nation's savior, the hero of the free world, and she had been at his side, a silent yet essential participant in that victory. But history has a cruel way of delivering shocks. Just weeks after this moment of glory in the general election of July 1945, Winston Churchill and his Conservative Party were defeated in a landslide. The British people, grateful for his wartime leadership, now craved a new future, a welfare state, and voted in the Labour Party. For the Churchill family, it was a crushing shock. From the peak of global adoration to political rejection in an instant. To Sarah, who had witnessed her father carrying the world, it must have felt like the ultimate ingratitude. The end of the war also brought the end of her marriage. Her relationship with Vic Oliver, which had been strained since before the war, was now beyond salvage. The distance was more than just geographical. Sarah had lived through Yalta and Tehran. She had decoded intelligence photos of V2 sites. Oliver remained a variety entertainer of the old world. They had nothing left to say to one another. They were formally divorced in 1945. Thus, by the close of 1945, Sarah Churchill, at 31, found herself at a peculiar crossroads. The war was over. She was demobilized. Her father was out of office. Her first marriage was shattered. The grandest role of her life, WAAF, officer and confidant to the Prime Minister, had abruptly ended. The question now was, what next? The woman who had run from the Churchill name was now forever linked to its war legacy. But the artist within her, who had been suppressed by duty and war, was still there. She turned back to her first love, the one that had caused so much trouble in the first place, the stage. After the war, Sarah returned to acting with a new urgency, but she was no longer the naive young girl of the 1930s. She was a woman who had seen the world made and broken. There was a new depth, a new complexity in her performances. She appeared in several successful West End plays, winning critical acclaim. She also began to turn back to film. It was in the vibrant yet anxious post-war art world of London that she met the man who would become her second husband. His name was Anthony Beauchamp. Beauchamp was a noted society and fashion photographer. He was handsome, charming, talented, and at the heart of the smart social scene in London. He was everything Vic Oliver was not: young, elegant, and part of the contemporary art world. To Sarah, he seemed the epitome of a fresh start, a chance to reclaim her artistic self, to live a life of beauty and creation after the austere years of the war. They fell passionately in love. Once again, Clementine was worried. Beauchamp, though talented, was also known to be volatile and somewhat unstable, but Sarah, as always, followed her heart. They married in 1949. This marriage opened a new chapter. It drew her back into the world of international glamour. Beauchamp worked in London, Paris, and New York, and it was New York, the city that saw her first marriage, that now beckoned her back, but on a completely new stage. She arrived in New York not just as Churchill's daughter or a retired WAAF actress. She arrived as Lady Sarah Beauchamp, one half of a glamorous artistic couple ready to conquer Broadway and Manhattan society. She was back in America, but this time she carried the weight of Yalta, the glory of the Buckingham Palace balcony, and the scars of a war that had reshaped her. She was stepping into the glittering world of post-war New York, a world of parties, ambition, and social swans. It was a world that a sharp observer named Truman Capote was just beginning to document. The Swan was back in the water, but this pond was more sophisticated, more glittering, and perhaps more dangerous than ever. She was stepping into the very messy pond Capote would soon describe, a world where past glories and private demons would collide with dramatic force. The Swan was back in the water, but this was a changed Swan. The woman who returned to post-war New York was no longer the rebellious ingenue. She was a retired intelligence officer who had witnessed Yalta, a divorcee, and now the wife of a fashionable photographer. Tempered by war and armed with a new glamorous marriage, Sarah entered New York society not as a fugitive, but as a rising star. It was here on the Broadway stage and in the Hollywood studios that she would reach the most brilliant heights of her career, and it was here that she would fall into the orbit of Truman Capote and his perfect, cruel world of swans. If London was a city recovering with grim fortitude, New York was a city exploding. It was the undisputed capital of the Western world, a forge of ambition, money, art, and power. And into this vibrant city, Lady Sarah Churchill stepped, not as a war refugee, but as a returning victor. Her marriage to Anthony Beauchamp placed her at the very center of the world she had always craved, the world of creative artists, trendsetters, the truly beautiful people. They were the perfect couple. He, the handsome, talented fashion photographer with a sharp eye. She, the aristocratic actress with a fiery red hair, a historical name, and a war resume no one could dismiss. This time she was back in America not to run from her name, but to use it, but on her own terms. She quickly established herself as a serious stage actress. She won acclaim starring on stage in the Philadelphia Story, taking on the role that Katharine Hepburn had made legendary. It was a perfect part, a clever, willful social heiress struggling with her own privilege and desires. It was almost a biographical role. The critics loved her. The audience loved her. She was no longer just Churchill's daughter. She was a Broadway star in her own right. But it was Hollywood, which had given her American start, that now beckoned her back for her crowning role. It was the golden opportunity, the moment that would launch her name, separate from her father's, onto the global stage. Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer was preparing a lavish, romantic musical, and they needed a leading lady for the undisputed king of the genre. In 1951, Sarah Churchill was cast to star opposite none other than Fred Astaire. Let that sink in. Fred Astaire, the icon of grace, perfection, and impeccable sophistication. He was a notorious perfectionist, a man of iron discipline who had danced with the greatest, Ginger Rogers, Rita Hayworth, Eleanor Powell. And now he had chosen Sarah. The film was titled Royal Wedding. The story was about a performing brother and sister who traveled to London during Princess Elizabeth's wedding. Sarah played Anne Ashman, a graceful English dancer whom Astaire's character falls for. It was a stroke of casting genius. She didn't just play a noble Brit, she was a noble Brit. She brought an authenticity, a class that no Hollywood actress could fake. But the great question was, could she keep up? She was a stage actress, not a professionally trained musical dancer. The pressure must have been immense. Dancing with Fred Astaire was like playing the violin next to Paganini. Every small mistake would be glaringly obvious. And Sarah delivered. She worked tirelessly. She practiced until her feet bled. She proved the iron will of the mule was not reserved only for analyzing intelligence photos. When the film was released, audiences were captivated. She was radiant. She was graceful, funny, and utterly believable. Her scene with Astaire gliding across the floor, singing "Open Your Eyes," was a moment of pure cinematic magic. The film was a smash hit, and it is forever associated with one of the most iconic sequences in film history, Astaire's solo dance on the ceiling. But for Sarah, it was a far deeper personal victory. This was the ultimate vindication. The young woman who defied her parents to go on the stage, the woman her mother warned would destroy herself, that she was pursuing a disreputable career. Now she was dancing with Fred Astaire in a major MGM blockbuster. She had proved to them all, to Clementine, to London society, to the doubters, that her talent was real, that her choice was right. At that moment, she seemed to have it all: a soaring career, a glamorous marriage, and a name that was both historical and utterly current. And it was at this peak of fame and success that she entered the world Truman Capote reigned over. New York society in the 1950s was a precisely defined ecosystem. At its apex were Capote's swans. These were not merely rich women. They were living works of art. Women like Babe Paley, the perfectly porcelain wife of CBS mogul Bill Paley, Slim Keith, the model-turned-socialite with a cool, sharp beauty, Gloria Guinness, the icon of international chic. Their world was one of absolute control. Everything was managed. Their hair, their clothes, the flower arrangements in their homes, even their spontaneous small talk. Their job was perfection. They were the high priestesses of a religion of style and status. They never let a hair fall out of place, never allowed an inappropriate emotion to show, and certainly they never ever let the effort show. Their grace had to look effortless. And then Sarah Churchill walked into this world. On the surface, she seemed to belong. She had the aristocratic lineage they craved. She had the beauty. She had the style. She was at all the right parties, at the right restaurants, like La Côte Basque, where Capote held court as a royal confessor. Capote was fascinated by her. She was a tantalizing addition to his collection. But she was also an anomaly. She was a living contradiction in their tightly controlled world. And this is where Capote's brilliant yet cruel observation came from. Sarah was the swan who could sing, but she chose to sing in the messy pond. Let's dissect that. The swan who could sing. Unlike the other swans who merely existed beautifully, Sarah had a real public talent. She did something. She was on stage 8 shows a week. She worked. She sang. To people like Babe Paley, having a real job, especially one as emotional and showy as acting, was considered slightly vulgar. It was a sign you needed to work, which the swans never admitted. But the crucial part is the second clause. In the messy pond. What was that messy pond? It was not just her career. It was everything about Sarah's life that she couldn't or wouldn't mask with a perfect veneer. The first messy pond was the theater itself. The theater was not a clean drawing room. It was a place of sweat, of weary repetition, of raw emotion, of cutthroat competition, of brutal reviews. It was a place where you had to expose your soul night after night. To the swans who guarded their privacy like a fortress, this idea was abhorrent. Sarah, by choosing to sing, voluntarily leaped into the chaos of public judgment and emotional exposure. The second messy pond was her marriage. Sarah's relationship with Anthony Beauchamp was not a stable, carefully arranged social alliance like Bill and Babe Paley's. It was a storm. It was passionate, artistic, and increasingly unstable. Beauchamp, though talented, was a profoundly troubled man. He was riddled with insecurity, jealous of her fame, feeling overshadowed by the great Churchill shadow. He was volatile, prone to depression, and like Sarah, he began to seek solace in alcohol. Their relationship was not a graceful waltz. It was a fiery, dangerous tango. They were the couple who might be seen passionately kissing in a corner of El Morocco one moment and heard screaming from their Park Avenue apartment an hour later. In Capote's world, where marriages were sustained by a silent pact of politeness and separate beds, this passionate chaos was both fascinating and terrifying. It was not clean. It was messy. And the third and most tragic, messy pond was Sarah's interior life. The pressure to sustain it all. The pressure of the Churchill name. Her father was now prime minister again. The pressure of being a Broadway star, having to be perfect night after night. The pressure of a volatile marriage. And beneath it all, the ghosts of the past, the memory of the war, the tension of Yalta, the complicated relationship with her mother. It began to be too much. And Sarah, like so many in her generation, turned to a familiar and dangerous coping mechanism: alcohol. It didn't begin as a problem. In the social world she inhabited, liquor flowed as freely as water. 3 martini lunches, cocktail parties that lasted until dawn. It was the norm. But for Sarah, it started to become something else. It was no longer a social lubricant. It was an anesthetic, a way to dull the anxieties, to silence the insecurities, to cope with the increasingly toxic arguments with Beauchamp. And Capote's world, the world of the Swans, noticed. They noticed everything. They would see that Sarah's glass was always full, that her laugh became a little too strident by the end of the evening, that her grace started to show signs of a wobble. To the Swans, this was the unforgivable sin, not the drinking, but the exposure. It was the loss of control. It was the messiness. It broke the illusion of flawless perfection. They might whisper about it, and they certainly did, with Capote avidly taking notes. They looked at her with a mix of pity and disdain. She was one of them, but she was fouling the nest. Then, the mess could no longer be contained in private drawing rooms. It began to spill into the streets. In the 1950s, Sarah Churchill's name began to appear in the press, not in theatrical reviews, but in police reports. The first story came like an electric shock to the public. Lady Sarah Churchill, the Prime Minister's daughter, had been arrested, often for drunk and disorderly conduct. Imagine the ignominy. Imagine the shame. This was the era before glamorous rehab, before checking into a facility was an accepted part of the celebrity cycle. Alcoholism was treated as a moral failing, a weakness of character. And for the daughter of Winston Churchill, the man who personified British strength and fortitude, it felt almost like an act of treason. Each incident was a knife plunged into the heart of the family. We can only imagine Clementine's reaction. Her worst fears had been realized, but in a way more hideous than she ever imagined. This was not merely social embarrassment. This was public destruction. Winston, then at 10 Downing Street, dealing with international crises, was simultaneously reading telegrams about his daughter being arrested in Los Angeles or New York. The pain and powerlessness he must have felt were boundless. He understood the black dog of depression. He understood the urge to escape, but he could not protect her from herself. Her career began to stall. Producers became hesitant to hire an actress who might not show up or show up in no condition to perform. The messy pond was becoming toxic. And then tragedy struck with a final irreparable cruelty. Her marriage to Anthony Beauchamp had completely broken down. The combination of two artistic, unstable souls, fueled by alcohol and insecurity, had become unbearable. They had separated. Beauchamp returned to London, sinking into despair over his declining career and shattered personal life. One September day in 1957, in his London flat, Anthony Beauchamp, age 40, committed suicide. He had taken an overdose of sleeping pills. The news hit Sarah like an atomic bomb. It went beyond shame or a failed career. This was an abyss of loss, guilt, and horror. Public opinion, fueled by the tabloids, was merciless. They blamed her. They painted a picture of a hard-partying alcoholic wife who had driven her talented but sensitive husband to the brink. The truth, as always, was far more complex. Beauchamp had his own demons, his own problems. But to Sarah, the complexity didn't matter. The man she had passionately loved was dead, alone, and she was his widow, condemned by the world. This was rock bottom. The glittering peak of royal wedding was only 6 years prior, but it felt like another century. Now, she was a public, tragic figure. The Swan who could sing was being swallowed by the very messy pond she had chosen. Capote had been terrifyingly right. She had lost her husband. She had lost her career. She had lost her self-respect. And she was on the verge of losing herself. Surrounded by grief and public condemnation, Sarah retreated to the only companion that seemed to remain: alcohol. She no longer just drank to cope. She drank to forget. Her true fight for survival, the war against herself, had only just begun. Beauchamp's death in 1957 marked the beginning of her irreversible decline, the moment when public sympathy turned into condemnation. To the outside world, and perhaps even in her own tormented mind, the chaos was no longer art. It was an accusation. Now, with no career or glamorous marriage to hide behind, there was only raw grief, guilt, and the unforgiving judgment of the public. For Sarah, this was the start of the wild years, a decade of shameful headlines, fleeting marriages and widowhoods, and a public war against demons she could no longer conceal. Beauchamp's death was more than a personal tragedy. It was a public conviction. In the eyes of the public, and perhaps in her own tormented mind, Sarah Churchill was no longer the glamorous actress or heroic daughter of a nation. She was the scandalous widow, the woman whose partying and alcoholism, the tabloids screamed, had driven a talented man to suicide. That conviction, however unfair and simplistic, became her reality. It was the millstone around her neck, dragging her from the messy pond Truman Capote observed into the cold, dark depths below. We must pause and understand the cruelty of this moment. Today, we have language for these things. We speak of mental health, of trauma, of addiction as a disease. In the 1950s, that language did not exist in public discourse. There was only shame. There was only moral failure. And Sarah, who had lived her entire life under the spotlight's glare, was now exposed at her most vulnerable moment with nowhere to hide. If alcohol had been an escape, a social palliative, it was now an essential need. It was the only wall, however thin, she could erect between herself and the unbearable grief, the guilt, and the world's relentless judgment. Her golden life in New York, the dances with Fred Astaire, the applause on Broadway, it all seemed to belong to someone else in a parallel universe. Her reality was now an empty room, a bottle, and the next day's headlines. Her career, which had been stalled, now collapsed entirely. No producer would risk hiring her. She had become a liability, a tragic figure whom the public came to see not for her talent, but for the possibility that she might fall apart before their eyes. And so began the wild years. This phase of Sarah's life was not defined by premieres or roles, but by a series of public, humiliating arrests, each one stripping away another layer of her dignity. The reports read like a repeated indictment. Lady Sarah Churchill arrested for drunk and disorderly. Churchill's daughter fights with police. Lady Sarah found wandering on Malibu Street. Each incident was a tiny tragedy. In October 1958, she was arrested outside a Hollywood nightclub after allegedly kicking a police officer. Imagine the tableau: the daughter of the man who faced down Hitler, scuffling on a Sunset Boulevard pavement. Another time, she was arrested in London. Another time in Italy. She had become an international problem, a traveling embarrassment. Magistrates would look at her with tired eyes, a mix of reluctant respect for her name and profound frustration at her condition. They would fine her 10 pounds. They would give her a suspended sentence, coupled with a stern but useless admonition: "Lady, you must pull yourself together." And she tried. Oh, how she tried. This is the most tragic part the headlines never captured. This was not a woman gleefully plunging into destruction. This was a woman desperately fighting for her life. Sandwiched between the arrests were agonizing periods of sobriety, stints in private clinics and nursing homes, trembling vows that this time will be different. But the disease of addiction is a cunning enemy. And for Sarah, it was supported by a powerful army of allies: unresolved grief, guilt, public shame, and a deep-seated insecurity that had plagued her since childhood. Every stumble, every relapse, only solidified the narrative the world was telling: that she was a failure, that she was unworthy of her name. And her family? What could they do? The shockwave resonated through the corridors of power and the private drawing rooms of the Churchill family with a devastating force. Consider Clementine. Lady Clementine Churchill, the epitome of restraint, dignity, and iron will. She had spent her life protecting her husband and the family name. She was a believer in stiff upper lip, in enduring in silence. And now, her daughter was exposing the family's suffering on the front page of every tabloid. To Clementine, it was the ultimate humiliation. Her relationship with Sarah, which had always been tense, was now pushed to the breaking point. She wrote letters, not soft letters of comfort, but razor-sharp letters of disappointment and fury. She viewed Sarah's alcoholism not as a disease, but as a moral weakness, a selfish self-indulgence. She tried to manage her, trying to force her into clinics, but she did so with a cold impatience born of her own shame. She could not understand why her daughter could not, by sheer force of will, pull herself together, just as Clementine had pulled herself together through the war years and Winston's own depressions. This lack of empathy, though born of anxiety, was the one thing Sarah needed least. It only intensified her feeling of worthlessness. And Winston? This was perhaps the deepest pain of all. By this time, Winston was an old man. He had retired as Prime Minister in 1955. The war hero, the greatest living Englishman, was now seeing his twilight years overshadowed by this personal tragedy. Unlike Clementine, Winston understood the darkness. He had battled his own black dog of depression his entire life. He understood on a visceral level the feeling of being besieged by inner demons. His power was boundless on the world stage, but he was utterly powerless to save his beloved mule. He could not make a speech or issue an order for her addiction to disappear. He could not threaten it into submission. He could only watch, heartbroken. His grief was evident in the letters he wrote to her during her rare periods of sobriety. They were not rebukes. They were a father's loving plea. "My darling mule," he wrote, "I am always thinking of you. I know you have the strength and the courage of our race." Courage. He still believed in that. Even when the world only saw weakness, he saw the WAAF officer who had been with him at Yalta, the stubborn daughter who had dared to dance with Fred Astaire. His helplessness was compounded by the fact that Sarah was not the only problem. His son Randolph, his greatest hope and biggest disappointment, was also fighting a public and disastrous battle with alcohol. It was a family tragedy. Some whispered of the Churchill curse, a toxic combination of genius, depression, and self-destructive tendencies, passed down through the generations. The legacy of their ancestor, the great Duke of Marlborough, as well as Clementine's own volatile Hosier family ancestry, seemed to have bequeathed not just talent, but a seed of instability. So while Winston and Clementine were trying to cope with Sarah's collapse, they were also dealing with Randolph. It was a two-pronged assault on their aged peace. Back to Sarah, she was caught in a vicious cycle. She drank because she felt shame and guilt, and then she felt shame and guilt because she drank. The press tracked her every move. She could not go out to dinner without being photographed. Every friend was suspected of being an enabler. She had become an outcast in the very society she had once reigned over. Capote's other Swans, the Babe Paleys and Slim Keiths, must have looked on with veiled revulsion. She was a living cautionary tale. She embodied their worst fear, public loss of control. While they guarded their perfect image at all costs, Sarah was tearing hers to shreds in public view. She proved Capote tragically right. The messy pond was no longer just a metaphor for an artistic life. It had become a toxic quagmire. Yet even in the deepest pit of despair, the human instinct is to seek connection, to seek rescue. And Sarah, even when shattered, was a woman of enormous passion and a heart desperate for love. In the early 1960s, between stints in clinics and court appearances, she met a man. His name was Thomas Touché Jessen. And, like the other men in her life, he was complicated. But he also had one thing she desperately needed, a title. He was the 23rd Lord Audley. Their marriage in 1962 surprised many. On the surface, it looked like a desperate grab for respectability. But Lord Audley was no stuffy, traditional aristocrat. Like Sarah, he had an artistic soul. He was a poet, an art lover, a man who was somewhat eccentric and quiet. Crucially, he seemed to accept Sarah's scars and demons and all. He did not try to fix her the way her mother did. He was not jealous of her fame like Beauchamp. He seemed to offer a sanctuary. This marriage, her third and final, was not a fiery romance like the previous two. It was a companionship, an alliance of two, perhaps weary souls who understood each other's darkness. Lord Audley, or Tom, as she called him, provided a much-needed stability. He was patient with her. He stood by her during her relapses and celebrated her moments of sobriety. He was not a miraculous cure. The battle with alcohol continued, a daily, hourly fight. But for the first time in years, she wasn't fighting it alone. There was a relative peace. The headlines subsided. She took up painting. She found solace in the arts just as her father had. It seemed that after a decade of extreme chaos, Sarah had finally found a harbor. Her life became quiet. She and Tom lived mostly in England, far from the New York spotlight that had witnessed both her glory and her ignominy. But fate was not done with her. Just 1 year into their marriage, in 1963, tragedy struck again with familiar cruelty. Lord Audley, the man who had brought her fragile peace, died suddenly of a heart attack. He was only 49. It was an unimaginable blow. She had been married only 16 months. The small, safe haven she had found was ripped away from her. Once again, she was a widow. Once again, she was alone. But this blow, though devastating, seemed to trigger something different in her. Perhaps it was the sheer shock. Perhaps it was the absolute exhaustion from tragedy. Or perhaps when faced with so much loss, a final reservoir of strength rose up. She did not completely collapse back into the abyss as she had done after Beauchamp's death. She grieved, but she held on. The stubborn mule was still there. She survived her husband's death. But a greater loss, one that would redefine her entire world, was imminent. Throughout all these turbulent years, there was one constant. One man whose existence, even when he was practically helpless, was an anchor to her entire life. Even when he was disappointed in her, his love was unquestionable. He was Winston Churchill. In January 1965, at the age of 90, the last giant of the 20th century passed away. Winston Churchill's death was more than a family event. It was a global one. It was the end of an era. London stopped. The world stopped. His state funeral was the largest in world history to that point. Kings, queens, presidents, and prime ministers from across the globe gathered at St. Paul's Cathedral to pay tribute. And there, in the eye of the global mourning, was Sarah. She walked behind her father's coffin, her face obscured by a black veil, a figure of silent tragedy. The world watched her, not with scorn as before, but with empathy. She was no longer drunk Sarah of the tabloids. She was the grieving daughter of a fallen hero. Imagine what went through her mind. The man who called her mule, the man she stood with at Yalta, the man who wrote her those desperate, loving letters when she was at her lowest. Her greatest protector, her rock, was gone. To many, such a loss following so much tragedy would have been the final strike. It could have easily sent her back into the abyss forever. But it seemed to have the opposite effect. Her father's death was not Sarah's end. It was a seismic shift. The great constant of her life was gone. The anchor was lifted. She no longer had to live under his immense shadow, nor was she protected by his boundless love. Everything had changed. She was now 50, a 3-time widow. Her father was gone. Her mother, Clementine, now Baroness Spencer Churchill, a national icon, remained distant. Her brother, Randolph, was also in rapidly declining health. The great Churchill dynasty, the golden age of power and influence, was truly over. Sarah was now utterly alone. She was stripped of all her roles, actress, wife, and now even the role of the daughter of a living icon. All that was left was simply Sarah, a middle-aged, scarred woman standing amidst the ruins of an extraordinary life, trying to figure out how to live the rest of it. Her father's death in 1965 was more than a grief. It was the end of a universe. The monumental man who had defined her entire existence, her personal son, her greatest shadow, and her final protector, was gone. The great Churchill dynasty, the golden age of power and influence, was truly over. Sarah was now utterly alone, stripped of all her roles, actress, wife, and now even the daughter of a living icon. It was in this final isolation that the family's final tragedies would strike, pushing her to her most humiliating low point, and finally a permanent retreat from the world. As the final gun salutes echoed over the Thames and the crypt door of St. Martin's Church at Bladon closed, something more than a father was buried. For the world, it was the end of an era. For Sarah Churchill, it was the final silencing of the great anchor in her life. For 50 years, no matter how high she flew or how deep she fell, there was one constant, her father. His love, his disappointment, his glory, and his colossal shadow. He was the one she both ran from and ran toward. He was the one who called her mule with affection. He was the one she served as an intelligence officer, whom she stood with at Yalta. He was also the one who had to read telegrams of her arrests with a pain she could only imagine. Now he was gone. The silence he left must have been deafening. There was no one left to disappoint on such a grand scale. No one left to run to for unconditional acceptance, even if veiled by rebuke. The burden of the Churchill name remained, but the man who bore it, who gave it its magical power and terrible weight, was no more. To many, such a seismic event could have been the final jolt to sobriety or the final push into the abyss. For Sarah, the path was unclear. Initially, the national mourning seemed to wrap the family in a dignified protection. Temporarily, the tabloids backed off. She was the grieving daughter of a national saint. But grief is a complex beast, and for a person accustomed to self-medicating her pain, the peace did not last. The world moved on. London began to swing. It was the age of the Beatles, of Mary Quant, of a wholly new generation with no memory of the Blitz or Yalta. Sarah Churchill, at 50, was not merely a mourner, she was a living relic. Her name belonged in museums and history books, but her person was still here, fighting very present demons. And then the second blow came, one perhaps more personally devastating. Just 3 years after their father's death in 1968, her brother Randolph died. Sarah's relationship with Randolph was always a storm. He was Winston's golden hope, the only son, and his greatest disappointment. Like Sarah, he was brilliant, charismatic, and profoundly self-destructive. He too fought a lifelong battle with alcoholism, with an explosive temper, and with the inescapable shadow of his father. They were the two problem children of the Churchill family. They fought viciously, but they also understood one another on a level no one else could. They were comrades in the family's messy pond. Randolph was the only one who truly understood the toxic mix of privilege and pressure that had shaped who she was. They shared the burden of the Churchill curse, and now he too was gone. At 57, his body had simply given out. This loss left Sarah utterly isolated. Her sister Diana was also a troubled soul. Now Randolph was lost. There was only her and her youngest sister Mary. Mary, now Lady Soames, was the normal one. Like Sarah, she had served in the war beside her father. But unlike Sarah, Mary had found stability. She was happily married to a respectable politician, Christopher Soames, had a large family, and lived a life of duty and balance. Mary was the rock, the keeper of the flame, but she was not the companion in Sarah's darkness. Sarah was now the sole survivor of the family's lost souls contingent. This isolation, the loss of her father and only brother, created a dangerous void. And into that void, her old demon returned with a vengeance. The late 1960s and early 1970s saw Sarah's final, most humiliating collapse. This time there was no New York glamour or royal wedding glory to soften the fall, just the grim, squalid reality. The arrests began again, but now they carried a pathetic desperation. She was no longer a disruptive party star. She was a middle-aged woman alone, publicly destroying herself. And then in 1970, she reached the absolute lowest point. Following a series of probation violations related to drunk and disorderly charges, including causing a chaotic scene at a West End club, shouting and throwing things, a judge, presumably at the end of his patience, issued a stunning sentence. Lady Sarah Churchill was sentenced to 7 days in Holloway Prison. Let that sink in. Holloway. A grim, notorious women's prison in London. This was not a private clinic in Switzerland. This was real jail, with locked cells, wardens, and unmitigated ignominy. The daughter of the man who saved Western civilization, the woman who stood at Yalta, who danced with Fred Astaire, was now an inmate, locked up alongside petty thieves and prostitutes. The humiliation was absolute. It was an unimaginable fall. We can only wonder what went through her mind as she heard the cell door clang shut. Was it relief, horror, or simply the tired numbness of one who has fallen so far they can no longer feel the ground? And Lady Clementine? Now, in her mid-80s, Baroness Spencer Churchill, the nation's most revered widow. The news of her daughter being sent to Holloway must have been an unbearable shame. Their relationship, which had been frozen by decades of disappointment, seemed now irreparably broken. Clementine, with her Victorian rigidity, could not forgive this public weakness. To her, it was the ultimate betrayal of Winston's legacy. But there is one thing about hitting rock bottom. There is only one way to go: up. The time in Holloway, short as it was, seemed to do what expensive clinics and family pleas could not. It scared her. It stripped away the final layer of illusion. She was no longer a glamorous, tragic figure. She was a dying alcoholic in a cell. After her release, something changed. The fight didn't end. For an addict, it never does, but a fragile truce began. She started a long, slow withdrawal from the world. She had had enough of public scrutiny. She had had enough of the messy pond of celebrity. She moved to a quiet apartment in Belgravia, London. She began to shun the parties. She took up painting seriously. Like her father, she found solace in the colors and the canvas. It was a way to express the emotions she couldn't articulate, a way to create beauty from the inner turmoil. And most importantly, she began to write. If the Swan song was acting, that song was now silent. But she found a new voice, a quieter, more interior one. She began to write her memoirs. In 1967, even before the worst tragedy, she had published a thread in the Tapestry. It was not an exposé, tabloid-worthy memoir the public might have expected. It wasn't about Hollywood, arrests, or alcoholism. It was almost entirely about her father. Specifically, it was about the war years. The title said it all. She was no longer trying to be a star in her own right. She had accepted that she was a thread in his far greater tapestry. The book was a beautiful, loving attempt to record his legacy from her unique vantage point, that of the daughter who was there at Yalta, at Tehran, in the study at 3 a.m. By writing it, she seemed to be trying to remind herself and the world that her life was not just the tabloid headlines, that once she had been a part of great things. It was an act of reclaiming her dignity. She was rewriting her own narrative, focusing the lens on her proudest moments, obscuring the rest in shadow. The 1970s passed in relative quiet. She lived a secluded life. The public scandals stopped. The inner battle continued, but it was fought behind closed doors. She had long periods of sobriety followed by agonizing relapses, but they were no longer public entertainment. She was cared for by loyal friends and her sister Mary, who, despite the distance, was always a presence of responsible love. Her mother, Lady Clementine, died in 1977. Her mother's death was the final severance of the link to the old generation, to the old battles for approval and rebellion. Now, both her parents were gone. Both giants who had shaped and in many ways warped her life were finally at rest. By the early 1980s, Sarah was living alone in her London flat. Her health, ravaged by decades of alcohol abuse, began to fail critically. The messy pond had finally exacted its price. Her body could no longer take the strain. She had written one more thin, haunting book of poetry, The Empty Spaces. The title seemed to sum it all up. The spaces left by her father, by her husbands, by her brother, by her career, and the void inside that she had tried to fill with liquor, with careers, with love, but never successfully. The Swan song was now a whisper, a lament of loss and weary acceptance. She was no longer fighting. She was simply existing, an elegant ghost in a city that had forgotten her dances and her scandals. On September 24, 1982, Lady Sarah Churchill died in her London home. She was 67. The reported cause of death was a heart attack, but those close to her knew the truth. It was the cumulative, inevitable result of years of heavy alcoholism. It was cirrhosis, the collapse of a body that had been pushed too far for too long. Her death did not cause a global ripple like her father's. It was a sad nod in the obituary pages. Lady Sarah Churchill, actress and daughter of late Prime Minister, dies at 67. They mention royal wedding. They mentioned her WAAF service, and they politely alluded to later troubled years. She was buried alongside her parents and siblings at St. Martin's Church in Bladen, just a short distance from Blenheim Palace where it all began. The circle was closed. The stubborn mule had come home, laid to rest beside her father, mother, and siblings. Her death in 1982 was a quiet end to a loud life, a silent final note to a chaotic score. But once the dust settled, once the tabloid headlines faded, and once the Churchill name moved from living history into myth, the great question remains: what did her life mean? How should we view the complex legacy of Sarah Churchill? And what does her messy, tragic, yet honest song say to us today? Today, decades after her peak influence, in a world saturated with social media influencers and self-help gurus who are, in many ways, her direct descendants, she remains an intensely controversial figure. Was she a pioneer, an early star who fought for the right to be herself, or was she simply a sad, tragic footnote on the margins of her father's grand history book? Was she a wasted talent, or a woman of incredible resilience who simply endured? The truth, as it is with all figures who genuinely change the world, or at least reflect it powerfully, is that she was all of those things. And it is in that contradiction, in that messy, vibrant, and often problematic space that her true and lasting significance lies. Her life was not a simple morality play. There is no neat lesson to be drawn. It is neither a simple story of triumph over adversity nor merely a sad tale of decline. It is a Greek tragedy written by the 20th century, a story of the deep, permanent contradiction between privilege and pain. Sarah Churchill was granted every advantage the world could bestow, a name synonymous with history, beauty, wealth, and undeniable talent. But she was also denied the one thing she perhaps truly needed: the right to anonymity, the permission to fail in silence, the freedom to be herself without turning it into a national scandal. Her story is a profound cautionary tale about the weight of expectation and the colossal shadows that great men cast. It is a lifelong search for identity when your identity has been decided for you at birth.